The phone slipped from my trembling fingers, clattering against the marble countertop of my kitchen island. For a moment, I stared at the screen, my son Derek's words glowing like acid against the black background. "Mom's finally dying. When do we get the house?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The message wasn't meant for me. It was in a group chat I'd accidentally been added to, one Derek shared with his sister Melissa and his wife Rachel. They thought they'd removed me weeks ago. They were wrong. I'm Eleanor Whitmore, and I've spent the last 6 months playing the role of a dying woman. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was actually healthier than I'd been in years, having finally quit smoking and started eating properly once the charade began. But my children didn't know that. They thought their 72-year-old mother was wasting away from pancreatic cancer, that the family fortune was within their greedy grasp. The house they were so eager to inherit sat on 12 acres of prime real estate in Connecticut's Gold Coast, worth roughly $8 million. Add the investments, the art collection, and the various properties, and we were talking about a $30 million estate. An estate they'd been circling like vultures ever since I'd announced my diagnosis in March. But here's what Derek and Melissa didn't know: there was no cancer. There never had been. I walked slowly to my living room, each step measured and deliberate, the way I'd trained myself to move these past months. The performance had to be consistent. I settled into my favorite armchair, the wingback chair my late husband Richard had bought me for our 20th anniversary, and pulled out my real phone. The one my children didn't know about. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dr. Harrison Chen answered on the second ring. "Eleanor? How are you feeling today?" "Perfectly fine, Harry. In fact, I just got some very interesting intelligence." I kept my voice steady, though my heart was racing. "I think it's time to accelerate our timeline." Dr. Chen had been our family physician for over 2 decades. He was also Richard's best friend and the only person who knew the truth about my condition, which was that I didn't have one. When I'd first approached him with my plan 6 months ago, he'd thought I'd lost my mind. It took 3 weeks of explanation before he understood what I was really doing. "What happened?" he asked quietly. I read him Derek's text, my voice growing harder with each word. When I finished, silence stretched between us. "Those bastards," he finally whispered. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry, Harry. Be ready. Because tomorrow, I'm going to give them exactly what they think they want." After hanging up, I walked through my house, really walked, without the careful shuffle I'd perfected for my children's visits. The Whitmore estate was magnificent, 14 rooms filled with antiques, original artwork, and 3 generations of accumulated wealth. Richard and I had built this life together from nothing, starting with a small construction company and expanding into real estate development across New England. Our children had grown up in this house, surrounded by luxury they'd never earned. They'd attended the finest schools, traveled the world, and wanted for nothing. And somehow, we'd raised 2 of the most entitled, heartless people I'd ever known. The signs had been there for years. Derek, now 38, had never held a job for more than 6 months. He lived in a downtown Boston condo I'd bought him, driving a car I'd paid for, married to a woman who saw dollar signs every time she looked at him. Melissa, 35, was no better. She'd married a hedge fund manager who'd lost most of his money in bad investments, and now they were counting on her inheritance to maintain their lifestyle in the Hamptons. Neither of them had visited me for Christmas last year. Derek had called twice in 2023 before my diagnosis, and Melissa had sent a birthday card she'd clearly had her assistant order online. But the moment I'd called them with news of my terminal cancer, suddenly they were devoted children again. Visiting weekly, asking about my will, suggesting I get my affairs in order. It was Melissa who'd first mentioned the house. "Mom, you shouldn't be alone in this big place while you're sick. Maybe you should consider moving somewhere smaller, closer to the hospital." Derek had been more direct. "Have you updated your will recently, Mom? I mean, with everything happening, you want to make sure everything's sorted out for when I die." They couldn't even say the words, but they were certainly thinking about the money. I'd played along beautifully. I'd hired a hospice nurse, actually an actress friend of Harry's who'd agreed to help with the deception. I'd lost weight deliberately, stopped wearing makeup, and learned to cough on command. Most convincingly, I'd started talking about my will, mentioning how important it was that my children were taken care of. But I'd also been busy with other arrangements. Ones they knew nothing about. My phone buzzed with another message in there. Group chat, Rachel, thank God. I was starting to think she'd live forever. Derek, call the lawyer tomorrow about the will. Melissa, finally. David's been asking about the timeline. We have debts to pay. Derek, I'll handle everything. She trusts me with the legal stuff. This house is going to solve all our problems. I screenshot every message, adding them to the folder I'd been building for months. The evidence folder outside, autumn rain pelted against the tall windows of my living room. It was October 15th, and I'd told my children that the doctors had given me until Christmas. Originally, I'd planned to let the charade continue until then, to see just how far they'd go. But Derek's text had changed everything. I picked up my house phone and dialed. Goldman, Reardon, and Associates. How may I help you? This is Eleanor Whitmore. I need to speak with James Goldman immediately. It's urgent. James had been our family attorney for 15 years. He knew about the fake cancer. I'd needed his help to ensure my real will was protected while I played this game with my children. What he didn't know was how dark their greed had become. Eleanor? James's voice was concerned. Is everything all right? I'm feeling perfectly vindictive, James. And I need you to prepare for tomorrow's performance. Because we're about to give my children the show of their lives. As I explained what I'd discovered, I found myself walking to Richard's old study. His desk still held his favorite fountain pen, the one he'd used to sign every major business deal. The man who'd taught me that in business, patience was a weapon and information was ammunition. Are you absolutely certain you want to do this? James asked when I'd finished explaining my plan. I thought about Derek's text. About my grandchildren, who barely knew me because their parents only brought them around when they needed money. About Melissa's husband David, who'd once told me at a family dinner that elderly people were a drain on society's resources. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. After hanging up with James, I sat in Richard's chair and opened the locked drawer that held my real will, the one my children had never seen. The one that would change everything. The document was thick, detailed, and nothing like what Derek and Melissa expected. I'd spent months crafting it with James's help, ensuring every clause was ironclad, every contingency covered. This wasn't just about money. This was about justice. I picked up the burner phone I'd been using to document everything and scrolled through the photos I'd been taking, Derek rifling through my jewelry box when he thought I was sleeping. Melissa measuring rooms in the house for redecorating, Rachel taking pictures of the antiques and texting them to auction houses. They'd been planning my death and their inheritance for months. Tomorrow, they'd learn what I'd been planning for them. The house settled around me as night fell, its familiar creaks and sighs like old friends keeping me company. I'd raised my children in these rooms, nursed them through childhood illnesses, celebrated their birthdays and graduations. I'd thought I was giving them everything. Instead, I'd apparently been raising sociopaths. My reflection stared back at me from the dark window, a woman who'd spent 6 months pretending to die so she could discover who her children really were. The experiment had been successful beyond my worst nightmares, but tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, Eleanor Whitmore would stop playing the victim and start playing the game she'd learned from 30 years of business with Richard. The game where the house always wins, and the players never see the cards until it's too late. I smiled at my reflection, feeling more alive than I had in months. After all, if my children wanted to inherit something from me, I was happy to oblige. They just weren't going to like what it was. The morning light filtered through my bedroom curtains as I lay perfectly still, practicing the labored breathing I'd perfected over the past 6 months. At exactly 7:30 a.m., my phone would ring. Derek always called at 7:30 on Fridays, not out of concern for my well-being, but to check if I was still alive to interfere with his weekend plans. Right on schedule. The phone rang. Mom? Derek's voice carried that practiced tone of worried affection he'd mastered. How are you feeling this morning? I let my voice crack slightly, adding the wheeze I'd been perfecting. Oh, Derek, not so good today, sweetheart. The pain it's getting worse. I'm sorry to hear that, Mom. Did you take your medication? The medication that didn't exist. Prescribed by Dr. Chen for a condition I didn't have. Yes, but it's not helping much anymore. There was a pause, and I could practically hear Derek calculating how much longer he'd have to maintain this charade. Well, I was thinking, maybe Melissa and I should come by today. We could bring lunch, spend some time with you. This was new. They rarely visited together unless they were planning something. That would be lovely, dear. I'd like that very much. Great. We'll be there around noon. Is there anything special you'd like us to bring? Just yourselves, I whispered, adding a small cough for effect. That's all I need. After hanging up, I sprang from bed with more energy than I'd felt in years. Today's performance would require precise timing, perfect execution, and flawless acting. Fortunately, I'd had 6 months to practice. I showered and dressed carefully in the clothes I'd chosen specifically for this day, a loose-fitting dress that emphasized my deliberate weight loss, minimal makeup to enhance the pallor I'd cultivated, and Richard's old sweater, the one that always made me look smaller and more fragile. At 9 a.m., Dr. Chen arrived through the back entrance, as we'd arranged. He carried his medical bag and the expression of a man who'd agreed to something that made him deeply uncomfortable. Eleanor, are you absolutely certain about this? He asked, setting down his bag in the kitchen. Once we start this, there's no going back. Harry, I've been certain since the moment I read that text. I poured him coffee in Richard's favorite mug. Besides, technically, we're not lying about anything today. We're just presenting information in a way they'll interpret incorrectly. He shook his head, but I could see the hint of a smile. Harry had loved Richard like a brother, and he'd watched Derek and Melissa grow up. He'd also seen how they'd treated their father during his final illness, more concerned with their inheritance than his comfort. Walk me through it one more time, he said. I pulled out my notebook, filled with months of careful planning. At noon, they arrive for lunch. At 12:30, I have my episode, nothing dramatic, just weakness and confusion. You arrive at 1 p.m., as if responding to Derek's emergency call. You examine me, look grave, and have that conversation with them in the hallway. And you're sure you can sell the confusion? I'd been practicing. Months of watching my mother's final battle with Alzheimer's had taught me exactly how cognitive decline presented. Trust me, I can be very convincing when I need to be. At 10 a.m., the actress who'd been playing my hospice nurse, Patricia Manning, arrived. She was a former Broadway performer who'd become a friend through our local theater group. When I'd first approached her with this plan, she'd thought it was the most elaborate method acting exercise she'd ever encountered. How's our patient today? Patricia asked, slipping into her nurse persona effortlessly. Declining rapidly, I replied with a grin. Patricia, I need you to be particularly pessimistic today. Really lay it on thick when you talk to them. She nodded, checking her watch. I'll leave at 11:45, just before they arrive. But I'll make sure to mention to Derek that you've been asking about your will a lot lately. The pieces were falling into place perfectly. At 11 a.m., James Goldman arrived with a thick manila folder and the same expression Harry wore, like a man who'd agreed to help stage his own funeral. The documents are ready, he said, placing the folder on my dining room table. But Eleanor, this is going to destroy your relationship with your children permanently. Even if you reveal the truth later, they'll never forgive you for this. I thought about Derek's text, about Melissa measuring my rooms, about Rachel researching auction houses for my antiques. James, they destroyed our relationship themselves. I'm just making it official. He opened the folder, revealing the fake will. I'd had him prepare, the one my children expected to see. It was simple and straightforward, the house and most of the estate divided equally between Derek and Melissa, with smaller bequests to charity and the grandchildren. This is what they'll find, James explained, dated 6 months ago, right after your diagnosis. It looks exactly like what grieving children would expect from a dying mother. Underneath was the real document, my actual will, finalized just 2 days ago. That one told a very different story. And you're certain the real will is legally binding? I asked. Absolutely. Multiple witnesses, properly notarized, and filed with the court yesterday. When the time comes, this fake will won't be worth the paper it's printed on. Patricia left exactly on schedule, making sure to stop and speak with Derek as he was arriving. Through my bedroom window, I watched their conversation, saw Derek's eager expression as she shook her head sadly and mentioned something about not much time left. Melissa arrived moments later, her BMW pulling up behind Derek's Mercedes. She'd dressed for the occasion in black, always the optimist, my daughter. I positioned myself in the living room, arranged carefully on the couch with blankets and pillows, looking as frail as possible. The performance was about to begin. "Mom?" Derek called out as they entered. "We're here." "In here, darling," I called weakly. They found me exactly as I'd planned, surrounded by photo albums, tissues within reach, looking like a woman taking one last look at her life. Derek's eyes immediately went to the manila folder on the coffee table, the one James had positioned perfectly. "Oh, Mom," Melissa said, rushing to my side with practiced concern. "You look so pale today." "I'm just tired, sweetheart. But I'm so glad you're both here." I reached for Derek's hand, noting how he flinched slightly at my touch. "I've been thinking about things, about the future." "You don't need to worry about that stuff now, Mom," Derek said, but his eyes kept drifting to the folder. "Actually, I do." I let my voice tremble slightly. "Dr. Chen was here earlier. The treatment, it's not working anymore." This got their full attention. Melissa sat down beside me, her face arranged in an expression of sorrow that almost looked genuine. "What did he say exactly?" Derek asked. "He said." I paused, as if gathering strength. "He said it might be weeks instead of months." The look that passed between my children was electric. Relief, excitement, and something that might have been actual grief, though I suspected that was just wishful thinking. "Mom, we're here for you," Melissa said, squeezing my hand. "Whatever you need." "That's why I asked James to prepare this." I gestured weakly toward the folder. "I wanted you both to see it, to know that everything's taken care of." Derek practically lunged for the folder, then caught himself and approached more carefully. "Are you sure you want us to look at this now? Please. It would give me peace of mind." I watched their faces as they read through the fake will, saw the relief and satisfaction they couldn't quite hide. Everything they'd expected, the house, the investments, the art collection, all divided between them exactly as they'd hoped. "Mom, this is very generous," Melissa said, her voice thick with what almost sounded like emotion. "You're our children. Everything Richard and I built was for you." What happened next was almost too perfect. Derek's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, then quickly put the phone away, but not before I caught a glimpse of the sender, Rachel. "I should probably head to the bathroom," I announced, standing carefully and making my way slowly down the hall, but instead of going to the bathroom, I slipped into the small alcove near the kitchen where I could hear their conversation clearly. "Jesus Christ," finally, Derek's voice was low but audible. "I was starting to think she'd drag this out forever." "The house alone is worth $8 million, Melissa whispered. "Plus the investments, the art." "Derek, we're looking at $15 million. Each, minimum." Rachel's been running the numbers. "With what I owe on the condo and the credit cards, this couldn't have come at a better time." "David's going to be so relieved. The hedge fund is hemorrhaging money, and we've been living on credit for months." I felt something cold settle on my chest. These weren't my children speaking, these were strangers wearing their faces. "Should we call Dr. Chen?" Melissa asked. "I mean, we should probably know exactly how much time we're talking about here." "Good idea. And maybe we should start thinking about arrangements. I looked into it last month, there are some really nice funeral homes in Greenwich." Last month. He'd been planning my funeral while I was still alive. I made my way back to the living room, remembering to walk slowly and hold the wall for support. "Everything all right, Mom?" Derek asked, his concerned expression sliding back into place seamlessly. "Just a little dizzy," I replied, settling back onto the couch. "It comes and goes." That's when I began the most important part of today's performance. I started small, a slight confusion about what day it was, a moment where I couldn't remember if I'd taken my morning medication. Then I let it escalate. "Derek, when is your father coming home?" I asked, looking directly at him. "He said he'd be back for lunch." The silence that followed was profound. Derek and Melissa exchanged glances, and I saw something flicker across their faces, not grief for their father, but excitement about what my confusion might mean for them. "Mom," Melissa said gently, "Dad passed away 3 years ago. Remember?" I let my face crumble with confusion and pain. No, that can't be right. He was just here this morning. He made coffee. Mom, you made the coffee, Derek said, but his tone wasn't gentle like Melissa's. It was impatient. I continued the performance for another 20 minutes, mixing moments of clarity with increasing confusion. I asked about their father twice more, forgot Derek's wife's name, and at one point, insisted that I needed to call my own mother. Each episode clearly frustrated them more, but I could also see the dollar signs dancing in their eyes. A confused, dying mother would be much easier to manage than a sharp, healthy one. At exactly 1 p.m., Dr. Chen rang the doorbell. I'll get it, Derek said quickly, practically running to the door. I could hear their hushed conversation in the foyer. Harry's professional tone as he explained that cognitive decline was common in the final stages, that confusion and memory loss were to be expected. How long are we talking about, Dr. Chen? That was Melissa's voice. I mean, in your professional opinion? It's difficult to say exactly, but given what I've observed today, I'd say we're looking at days rather than weeks. The sharp intake of breath from both my children was audible even from the living room. Harry entered with his medical bag, playing his role perfectly. He examined me gently, asked questions about my pain levels and confusion, all while my children watched with barely concealed anticipation. Mrs. Whitmore, he said finally, I think we need to discuss making you more comfortable. Perhaps it's time to consider increasing your pain medication. Will that help with the confusion? Derek asked. Unfortunately, no. That's likely to get worse before the end. After Harry left, my children stayed for another hour. Ostensibly to keep me company, but actually to have more conversations I wasn't supposed to hear. I dozed fitfully on the couch, listening to them plan their inheritance like generals dividing conquered territory. We should probably take turns staying with her, Melissa suggested. I don't want her alone. Good idea. I can take tonight. You take tomorrow night, Derek agreed. And we should probably start going through some of her things. To help her organize. By organize, they clearly meant inventory for division. When they finally left at 4 p.m., I watched from my window as they stood beside their cars, talking animatedly. Derek pulled out his phone and showed Melissa something, probably a calculator app, figuring out their shares down to the penny. After their cars disappeared down the driveway, I let myself collapse into Richard's chair, exhausted from the day's performance but exhilarated by its success. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. My children had revealed themselves completely, confirmed every suspicion I'd harbored, and validated every decision I'd made about my real will. I picked up my secure phone and called James. How did it go? He asked immediately. Better than I could have hoped. They bought every second of it. James, I need you to accelerate the timeline for the real will. I want everything finalized and documented before the weekend. Eleanor, what exactly are you planning? I smiled, looking out at the estate my husband and I had built together, the legacy we'd intended to leave our children. I'm planning to give them exactly what they deserve, James. Nothing more, nothing less. As evening fell, I prepared for Derek's overnight visit. He'd be here soon, probably with a suitcase and plans to search through my personal belongings while I slept, but I had plans of my own. Tonight, Derek would get a front row seat to his dying mother's final wishes. He just wouldn't know he was watching a performance until it was far too late. The game was accelerating, and I was winning every hand. Derek arrived at 7 p.m. with an overnight bag and the kind of solemn expression he might wear to a board meeting. He'd changed into casual clothes, jeans and a sweater, but I noticed he'd kept his expensive watch and wedding ring. Even playing the devoted son, he couldn't resist displaying his wealth. How are you feeling, Mom? He asked, setting his bag down in the foyer with the careful movements of someone entering a sacred space. Or a crime scene. Tired, sweetheart. Very tired. I was bundled on the living room couch, surrounded by photo albums and what appeared to be random mementos I'd gathered throughout the day. In reality, every item had been chosen strategically. I've been looking through old pictures. Do you want to see? Derek's face tightened almost imperceptibly. He clearly had no interest in taking a trip down memory lane, but he settled beside me with practiced patience. The first album contained photos from his childhood, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, family vacations to Europe. I watched his face as we turned the pages, looking for any flicker of genuine emotion. Instead, I saw calculation. "You were such a beautiful baby," I murmured, pointing to a photo of 2-year-old Derek on Richard's shoulders at the beach. "Your father was so proud. He used to carry you everywhere." "Yeah, I remember some of those trips," Derek said, but his tone was distracted. His eyes kept wandering to the various valuable objects scattered around the room, the Tiffany lamps, the original paintings, the antique silver pieces I'd inherited from my grandmother. "Derek, can I ask you something?" "Of course, Mom. Are you happy? In your life, I mean. Really happy?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He shifted uncomfortably, and for a moment, I saw something almost genuine cross his features. Yeah, Mom. Of course I'm happy. I have Rachel, the condo, good friends, all things I'd either purchased or paid for." But I nodded as if his answer satisfied me. "That's good. That's what your father and I always wanted, for you and Melissa. To be happy. That's why we worked so hard, built all this." I gestured vaguely around the room. "We wanted to give you everything. And you did, Mom. You really did." The lie came so easily to him that I almost admired his skill. At 8 p.m., I excused myself for what I claimed was an early bedtime. In reality, I had work to do. I'd installed hidden cameras throughout the house months ago, not just for security, but because I'd suspected my children might be doing exactly what Derek was about to do. From my bedroom, I watched on my tablet as Derek waited exactly 15 minutes before beginning his true mission. First, he checked the liquor cabinet, selecting a bottle of Richard's best scotch, the 30-year-old Macallan worth more than most people's monthly salary. Then he began his systematic search. He started with my desk in the study, carefully photographing every document he found. Bank statements, investment portfolios, insurance policies. He documented everything with the efficiency of a professional investigator. What he didn't know was that every document he was photographing was either outdated or deliberately misleading. Next, he moved to the safe. I watched him try several combinations, important family dates, birthdays, anniversaries. He didn't know that I'd changed the combination months ago, or that the safe now contained nothing but costume jewelry and meaningless papers. The real valuables were in a safety deposit box Derek didn't know existed. At 10 p.m., Derek made his first phone call. "Rachel? Yeah, I'm here." "No, she's asleep. Listen, I've been going through some of her paperwork." He lowered his voice, unaware that my hidden microphones could pick up a whisper. "The investment portfolio is even bigger than we thought. There's over 12 million just in stocks and bonds." I smiled in the darkness. Those statements were 3 years old, from before Richard had made some very strategic moves with our finances. "Yeah, I know. And get this, I found documentation for 3 other properties. A condo in Florida, something in the Hamptons, and what looks like a cabin in Vermont. We're going to be set for life, baby." The Florida condo had been sold 2 years ago. The Hamptons property belonged to my cousin. And the Vermont cabin was worthless swampland Richard had bought as a tax write-off in the 1990s. Derek continued his treasure hunt until nearly midnight, photographing everything, making lists on his phone, even measuring some of the larger antiques. I watched him work with a mixture of fascination and disgust. This was my son, the child I'd rocked to sleep, taught to ride a bicycle, comforted through nightmares, systematically cataloging my possessions like an estate sale appraiser. Around 12:30 a.m., Derek received a text that made him smile for the first time all evening. I couldn't make out the message from my camera angle, but his response was clear enough: "Soon, baby. Very soon." That's when I decided it was time for the next phase of my performance. I crept downstairs, moving carefully in the darkness. Derek was in the living room, examining my grandmother's silver tea service with his phone's flashlight. He was so focused that he didn't hear me approach. "Derek?" I called softly, my voice carrying confusion and fear. "Is that you?" He spun around, nearly dropping the silver creamer. "Mom. Jesus, you scared me. What are you doing up?" "I couldn't sleep. I keep having these dreams." I let my voice trail off, wrapping my robe tighter around myself. "I heard noises. Are we being robbed?" "No, Mom, no robbery. It's just me." I couldn't sleep either, so I came down for some water. I looked pointedly at the tea service in his hands, then at the notebook and phone beside it. Derek followed my gaze and had the grace to look embarrassed. I was just looking at some of the family pieces. Remembering when Grandma used to serve tea from this set. She never served tea from that set, I said quietly. That was her mother's silver. She only brought it out for Christmas. Derek's face went pale. Right. Of course. I'm not thinking clearly. It's been a long day. I moved closer, studying his face with the intensity of a mother who suspects her child is lying. Which, of course, he was. Derek, can I tell you something? Something I've never told anyone? He nodded, probably hoping this wouldn't take long so he could get back to his cataloging. I'm scared, I whispered. Not of dying, I've made my peace with that. I'm scared of what happens after. To the family, to everything your father and I built. I'm scared that somehow we failed you and Melissa. Mom, you didn't fail us. Why would you think that? Because. I paused, as if struggling with how to express my thoughts. Because I look at your lives, and I see that you're always struggling. Always needing money, always worried about finances. Your father and I gave you every advantage, and yet. We're doing fine, Mom. Are you? Derek, I know about the credit card debt. I know about the problems with the condo payments. Melissa thinks I don't know about David's hedge fund failures, but I do. Derek's face had gone through several shades of pale. How do you? I'm dying, sweetheart, not stupid. Did you think I wouldn't notice when my children only call when they need money? When they only visit when there's something to be gained? The silence that followed was deafening. Derek opened his mouth several times, but no sound came out. I've been thinking, I continued, my voice growing stronger. Maybe the problem isn't that we didn't give you enough. Maybe the problem is that we gave you too much. Mom, I don't understand what you're saying. I'm saying that perhaps your father and I made a mistake. Perhaps we should have taught you to build something yourselves instead of simply inheriting what we built. Derek's eyes went wide with something approaching panic. But the will. You showed us the will today. Yes, I did. I picked up the silver creamer he'd been examining, turning it over in my hands. My grandmother earned the money to buy the silver by taking in washing for other families. 12 hours a day, standing over a washboard, so she could give her children something better. I set the creamer down gently. She would be ashamed to know that her great-grandson was skulking around in the dark, cataloging her possessions before his own mother was even dead. Derek's face crumpled. For a moment, I thought I might have broken through to him, that somewhere inside the greedy man he'd become was still the little boy who used to climb into my lap when he was sad. Mom, I'm sorry. We're in trouble. Real trouble. The debts are bigger than you know, and Rachel. She's been pushing me to figure out our options. What kind of trouble, Derek? And then he told me the full truth, or at least a version of it. The gambling debts that Rachel didn't know about. The failed investments he'd made with money borrowed against his trust fund. The second mortgage on the condo that Rachel thought was for renovations but was actually to cover his losses. I owe some very dangerous people a lot of money, Mom. And if I don't pay them soon. He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air between us. How much? I asked quietly. 2 million. Maybe a little more. I felt something inside me break. Not from disappointment, I'd moved past that months ago. It broke from the sheer waste of it all. The opportunities squandered, the lessons never learned, the character never developed. And you thought that when I died, you'd use your inheritance to pay off these debts? Derek nodded miserably. I know how it sounds, but Mom, if something happens to me, what happens to Rachel? What happens to the family name? The family name, I repeated slowly. Derek, do you know what our family name meant when your father was building this business? It meant integrity. It meant keeping your word. It meant taking care of the people who worked for you and the community that supported you. I stood up, suddenly feeling every one of my 72 years. And now you want to use blood money to pay off gambling debts to criminals. It's not like that, it's exactly like that. I turned to face him fully. Derek, I want you to pack your things and leave. Now. But Mom, you said you didn't want to be alone. I'd rather be alone than spend my last days watching my son pick through my belongings like a vulture. Derek's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, desperation, and finally, something cold and calculating that I'd never seen before. "You know what, Mom? Fine. You want to play the martyred saint, go ahead. But don't pretend you're better than us. You and Dad created this situation. You taught us that money was the answer to everything. You bought our love instead of earning it." His words hit like physical blows, not because they were cruel, but because there was a grain of truth in them. "You're right," I said quietly. "We did make mistakes. We did give you too much, too easily. But Derek, we gave you money. We didn't give you permission to become a person without character." He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw him make a decision. The son I'd loved was disappearing, replaced by a stranger with my child's face. "I'll pack my things," he said coldly. "But Mom? When you're lying in that hospital bed in a few weeks, remember that you chose to be alone. You chose to push away the people who loved you." "The people who loved me," I repeated. "Or the people who loved my money?" Derek grabbed his bag and headed for the door. At the threshold, he turned back one last time. "You'll change your mind. When you realize what you're giving up, what you're throwing away, you'll call me. And when you do, remember this conversation." After he left, I sat in the silence of my empty house, surrounded by the possessions he'd been so eager to catalog. For the first time since this whole charade began, I felt a wave of genuine sadness. Not for Derek, I'd lost that son years ago, I was just now admitting it. I felt sad for the little boy who used to help me bake cookies, who used to bring me dandelions from the yard and call them flowers. Somewhere along the way, that little boy had died, and I'd been too busy giving his replacement everything he wanted to notice. I picked up my secure phone and called James, despite the late hour. "Eleanor? Is everything all right?" "Change of plans, James. I want to move up the timeline. How quickly can we execute the real will?" "Well, technically, we could do it any time. But Eleanor, what happened?" I told him about Derek's confession, about the gambling debts and the criminals and the complete lack of remorse. When I finished, the line was quiet for a long moment. "$2 million in gambling debts," James finally said. "Eleanor, if he's telling the truth about owing money to dangerous people, then my death won't solve his problems. It will just give him more money to lose." I walked to Richard's study, looking at the chair where my husband used to sit when he was planning strategy for his business. "James, I want Derek and Melissa to know the truth. Soon. But first, I want them to show me exactly who they really are." "What are you thinking?" I smiled, feeling Richard's presence in the room with me. "I'm thinking it's time to write my own obituary. And I'm thinking my dear children should be the ones to deliver the eulogy. After all, if they were so eager for me to die, the least I could do was give them exactly what they wished for." The call came at 3:47 a.m., jolting me from the first real sleep I'd had in weeks. Not the performance sleep I'd been practicing, but actual rest. For a moment, I forgot I was supposed to be dying. "Mrs. Whitmore?" The voice was professional, clinical. "This is Dr. Sarah Martinez from Greenwich Hospital. I'm calling about Derek Morrison. He's been in an accident." My blood turned to ice. "What kind of accident?" "A car accident on I-95. He's alive, but he's in serious condition. He was asking for you." I was out of bed and dressed before the call ended, my mind racing through possibilities. Had Derek been drinking after our confrontation? Was this connected to the dangerous people he owed money to? Or was this simply the universe's way of complicating an already impossible situation? The drive to the hospital gave me 20 minutes to think, and by the time I arrived, I'd made a decision that would change everything. Derek was conscious but heavily sedated when I reached his room. His face was a mass of bruises, his left arm in a cast, and monitors beeped steadily around his bed. When he saw me, his eyes filled with tears. "Mom," he whispered. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry about tonight." I pulled a chair close to his bed, noting how young he looked with his defenses stripped away. "Don't talk, sweetheart. Just rest." "No, I need to say this." His voice was weak but determined. "You were right about everything. About me, about the money, about what we became. I never meant for it to go this far." Dr. Martinez appeared in the doorway, a young woman with kind eyes and tired posture. "Mrs. Whitmore? Could I speak with you privately?" In the hallway, she delivered news that made my knees weak. "Your son was driving erratically when he hit the guardrail. His blood alcohol was well over the legal limit, but that's not the most concerning part." She paused, checking her clipboard. Mrs. Whitmore, Derek told the paramedics that he was being followed. He said someone had been calling him all evening, threatening him. We found his phone at the scene, it was smashed, but our security team recovered several threatening voicemails. The gambling debts. The dangerous people Derek had mentioned. This wasn't an accident at all. Doctor, is my son safe here? We've contacted the police, and they've assigned an officer to monitor his room. But Mrs. Whitmore, Derek mentioned that you've been ill. Are you alright? You look pale. I almost laughed at the irony. After 6 months of pretending to be dying, I was genuinely terrified for the first time. I'm fine. Can I see him again? Back in Derek's room, I found him staring at the ceiling, tears streaming down his bruised face. They found me, Mom. The people I owe money to. They said if I don't pay by Monday. Sure. We'll figure this out. No, we won't. Derek turned to look at me, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years, vulnerability. Mom, I need to tell you something. The inheritance money, even if I got every penny from the will, it wouldn't be enough. I lied about how much I owe. My heart sank. How much, Derek? 5 million. Maybe 6. I've been gambling online, making bigger and bigger bets trying to win back what I lost. And when that didn't work, I borrowed from a loan shark. Then I borrowed from another one to pay. The first one. $6 million. More than his entire inheritance, even if I died tomorrow and left him everything. Derek, why didn't you come to me months ago? Before it got this bad? Because I was ashamed. And because? He closed his eyes. Because I knew you'd be disappointed in me. Again. The word again hit me like a physical blow. How many times had I shown disappointment instead of guidance? How many times had I thrown money at problems instead of teaching him to solve them himself? Derek, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Are you listening? He nodded. I'm not dying. The monitors around his bed seemed to pause as Derek processed my words. What? I don't have cancer. I never had cancer. The whole thing was a lie. Derek stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. But Dr. Chen, the hospice nurse, the will, all part of an elaborate test. I wanted to know who you and Melissa really were when you thought I was dying. I wanted to see if you'd show compassion or greed. The machines started beeping faster. As Derek's heart rate spiked. You've been lying for 6 months? Yes. The confusion yesterday? The memory problems? All an act. Derek was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ceiling. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat. So you heard everything. The phone calls, the planning, all of it. Everything. And now you know what kind of person I really am. I reached for his uninjured hand. Derek, I know what kind of person you became. But lying here, seeing you hurt, watching you cry, I also remember who you used to be. Mom, I don't understand. If you're not dying, why are you telling me this now? I pulled out my phone and showed him a photo of the real will, the one that left everything to charity except for small trust funds for my grandchildren. Because this is my actual will. Derek, I was planning to reveal the truth after watching you and Melissa fight over a fortune that was never going to be yours. Derek's face went through several emotions, shock, anger, devastation, and finally, something that might have been relief. So I'm not getting anything. That's right. And you've known about my gambling this whole time. I suspected. Tonight confirmed it. Derek was quiet for several minutes, the only sound the steady beeping of his monitors. Finally, he spoke. Mom, can I ask you something? And will you give me an honest answer? Of course. If this accident hadn't happened, if I hadn't ended up here, were you planning to destroy me? Completely? The question hung in the air between us. I thought about the elaborate plan I'd constructed, the public humiliation I'd designed, the absolute devastation I'd intended to inflict. Yes, I admitted. I was going to let you and Melissa believe you were inheriting everything right up until the reading of the will. I wanted you to experience the same kind of disappointment you'd inflicted on others. And now? I looked at my son, bruised, broken, facing threats from criminals, addicted to gambling, drowning in debt that could get him killed. The revenge I'd planned seemed suddenly pointless. Now I think you're destroying yourself more thoroughly than I ever could. Derek actually smiled at that, a weak but genuine expression. You're probably right. Derek, I have a proposition for you. I'm listening. I will pay off your debts. All of them. But there are conditions. His eyes widened. What conditions? First, you check yourself into a gambling addiction treatment program. A real one, residential, minimum 90 days. Okay. Second, you and Rachel move out of the condo. I'm selling it. You'll live in a modest apartment that I'll pay for, and you'll get a job. A real job with a real salary. Mom, I don't know if anyone will hire me. My resume is pretty thin. You'll start at the bottom of one of our construction companies. 40 hours a week, minimum wage to start. You'll learn what it means to earn money instead of inheriting it. Derek was quiet, processing the terms. And if I do all this? Then in 5 years, if you can prove you've changed, if you can show me that you understand the value of money and work and character, I'll consider reinstating a portion of your inheritance. How much? Enough to live comfortably. Not enough to live extravagantly. Derek closed his eyes. And if I refuse? Then you deal with your debts yourself, and you never see me again. What about Melissa? Melissa gets to make her own choice. But Derek, I should tell you, she's probably going to be furious when she finds out the truth. She's been planning to renovate the Hamptons house with her share of the inheritance. Derek actually laughed at that, wincing as it hurt his ribs. She's going to kill you. She's already ordered new furniture. Let me worry about Melissa. A nurse entered to check Derek's vitals, giving us both a moment to think. When she left, Derek reached for my hand. Mom, can I ask you something else? Yes. When did you stop loving me? The question broke my heart. Derek, I never stopped loving you. But I did stop liking who you became. There's a difference. When Dad was sick, at the end. I know I wasn't there enough. I know I was more worried about the business than spending time with him. Your father noticed. What did he say? I hesitated, then decided Derek deserved the truth. He said he was worried we'd failed you both. That we'd given you everything except the tools to become good people. Derek was crying again, silently this time. He was right. Maybe. But Derek, good people aren't born, they're made. Every day, through choices and actions and decisions. It's never too late to start making better choices. Even for someone like me. Especially for someone like you. Dr. Martinez returned with update. Mrs. Whitmore, we're going to keep Derek for observation for another day or two. The police want to interview him about the threats, and we want to monitor his head injury. After she left, Derek grabbed my arm. Mom, you have to be careful. These people, they might come after you too. They know you have money. Derek, don't worry about me. Worry about getting better. Will you call Rachel? Tell her about the accident but not about the other stuff yet? I want to tell her. Myself. Of course. As I prepared to leave, Derek stopped me one more time. Mom? Thank you. For what? For giving me a chance to try again. I know I don't deserve it. I kissed his forehead, tasting salt from his tears. Everyone deserves a second chance, Derek. But this is your last one. Driving home as dawn broke over Connecticut, I realized that everything had changed. The elaborate revenge I'd planned seemed petty now, almost cruel. Derek was broken enough without my help, but I also realized something else. For the first time in months, I felt like a mother again instead of a chess master. The difference was profound. Now I had to figure out how to handle Melissa, who was still expecting an inheritance that was never coming. Unlike Derek, she hadn't been in a car accident to humble her. She was still the entitled, grasping woman who'd been measuring my house for renovations. That conversation was going to be very different. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway. Melissa's name appeared on the screen. Mom? Derek called me about the accident. I'm on my way to the hospital. He's going to be fine, sweetheart. Thank God. Mom, this whole thing has made me realize life is so fragile. We need to spend more time together, especially with everything you're going through. I sat in my car, listening to my daughter's concern that I now knew was at least partially motivated by her fear of losing her inheritance source. Melissa, we definitely need to talk. In fact, why don't you come to the house after you visit Derek? There are some things I need to tell you. Of course, Mom. I'll be there this afternoon. As I hung up, I realized that while Derek's story might have a chance at redemption, Melissa's was just beginning. Melissa arrived at 3 p.m. wearing head-to-toe black Chanel, as if she'd dressed for a funeral that hadn't happened yet. Her BMW was freshly detailed, and she carried a leather portfolio that I recognized as expensive enough to feed a family for months. Even visiting her supposedly dying mother, she couldn't resist displaying her wealth. "Mom, you look terrible," she said, air-kissing my cheek. "Have you been eating? You're so thin." I was thin because I'd deliberately lost weight for my performance, but Melissa's concern felt genuine enough that I almost felt guilty. Almost. "I've been worried about Derek," I replied, leading her into the living room. "How was he when you saw him?" "Shaken up, but he'll be fine. The doctors say he was lucky." Melissa settled onto the couch, immediately scanning the room with the same acquisitive eyes I'd seen from Derek. "Mom, we need to talk about your care. You can't be alone in this big house, especially after what happened to Derek." "Actually, Melissa, there are several things we need to discuss. But first, tell me about David. How are things with the hedge fund?" A shadow crossed Melissa's face. "Oh, you know David. Always working, always stressed about the markets." "Why do you ask?" "I'm curious about my children's lives." "Is that so strange?" Melissa shifted uncomfortably. "No, of course not. It's just, Mom, we should focus on you right now. On your health, your comfort." "My comfort," I repeated. "Melissa, what would make me most comfortable right now?" "Whatever you need. Better pain medication, maybe a live-in nurse, or..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Or maybe it's time to think about moving somewhere smaller. Somewhere with medical staff nearby." There it was. The same suggestion Derek had made, the same underlying message: get out of the valuable house so we can figure out how to sell it. "You think I should move out of my home?" "Not permanently. Just until you're feeling better." Melissa's voice took on that coaxing tone she'd used as a child when she wanted something. "Mom, this house is so big, so isolated. What if something happens and no one's around to help?" "Like what happened to Derek, you mean?" "Exactly. At least Derek was on a main road where people could find him. Here, you're all alone." I walked to the window, looking out at the gardens Richard and I had planted together 30 years ago. "Melissa, do you remember when you were 7 and you wanted a pony?" "Mom, what does that have to do with, do you remember what your father told you?" Melissa sighed. "He said I had to prove I was responsible first. I had to take care of a goldfish for 6 months without it dying." "And what happened to the goldfish?" "It died after 3 weeks because I forgot to feed it." Melissa's voice was impatient. "Mom, I don't understand why we're talking about this." "Because 30 years later, you're still the same person who let that goldfish die from neglect." The silence that followed was profound. Melissa's face went through several expressions before settling on defensive anger. "That's a horrible thing to say. I was 7 years old." "You're right. You were 7. But Melissa, what's your excuse now?" "My excuse for what?" I turned from the window to face her directly. "For measuring the rooms in this house while you thought I was sleeping. For researching auction houses for my antiques. For planning renovations on a Hamptons house that doesn't belong to you." Melissa's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me." My voice was quiet but steel-edged. "I have photographs, Melissa. I have recordings. I have documentation of every conversation you and Derek have had about dividing up my estate." "Mom, you're confused. The medication, there is no medication. There is no cancer. There never was." The words hit Melissa like physical blows. She stood up abruptly, her portfolio tumbling to the floor. "What did you just say?" "I'm not dying, Melissa. I've been testing you and Derek for 6 months, and you've both failed spectacularly." Melissa stared at me for a long moment, then suddenly smiled. "Oh, thank God. Mom, I knew something felt wrong about that diagnosis. I'm so relieved." The performance was impressive, but I'd been expecting it. Unlike Derek, who'd been humbled by his accident, Melissa was going to fight. "Are you relieved, Melissa? Or are you disappointed?" "Disappointed? Mom, how could you even ask that? I'm thrilled that you're healthy." I walked to my desk and pulled out a thick folder. "These are printouts of text messages between you, Derek, and your spouses. Would you like me to read some of them?" Melissa's smile faltered. Mom, you're misunderstanding, finally. David's been asking about the timeline. We have debts to pay. I read from the top page. That was your response when Derek texted that I was dying. You took that out of context. The house alone is worth $8 million. Plus the investments, the art. Derek, we're looking at $15 million each, minimum. I looked up at her. Should I continue? Melissa's composure finally cracked. You spied on us. You violated our privacy. I protected myself from children who were planning my funeral before I was dead. We were grieving. You were calculating. I dropped the folder on the coffee table. Melissa, in 6 months of believing I was dying, you visited me 12 times. Exactly 12. Derek visited 10 times. Do you know how many times either of you called just to see how I was feeling, without asking about money or property or my will? Melissa was silent. 0. Not once. Mom, you're being unfair. We were trying to be practical. Practical? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Melissa, you hired an interior designer to plan renovations for a house in the Hamptons. You put a deposit down on new furniture. You did all of this while believing your mother was dying of cancer. The Hamptons house was an investment property. We were trying to increase its value for the estate. The Hamptons house belongs to my cousin Patricia. It always has. Melissa's face went through several shades of red. But the documents in your desk were deliberately misleading. Everything you and Derek found during your little treasure hunts was either outdated or completely fabricated. You set us up. I gave you rope. You hanged yourselves. Melissa began pacing, her Louboutin heels clicking against the hardwood floor. This is insane. You're punishing us for being concerned about our inheritance. That's normal, Mom. Everyone worries about these things. Normal people worry. They don't celebrate. We weren't celebrating. I pulled out my phone and played a recording from the night Derek had stayed over. Melissa's voice filled the room, thank God. I was starting to think she'd live forever. Melissa listened to her own words with growing horror. You recorded us? Every conversation. Every phone call you made in this house. Every private moment you thought you were having while my supposedly dying body was upstairs. That's illegal. Actually, it's not. This is my house, and Connecticut is a one-party consent state. But Melissa, even if it were illegal, do you really want to discuss ethics right now? Melissa collapsed back onto the couch, her perfect composure completely shattered. What do you want from me? I want you to tell me the truth. For once in your life, just tell me the truth. About what? About David's hedge fund. About your debts. About why you really need this inheritance. Melissa was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. David lost everything. Not just our money, his client's money too. He's being investigated by the SEC for fraud. My blood ran cold. What kind of fraud? He was running a Ponzi scheme. Small scale, mostly friends and family, but enough to get him arrested if the wrong people find out. Melissa looked up at me with tears in her eyes. Mom, we're not just broke. We're facing criminal charges. How much money are we talking about? 8 million. Maybe 10. And if David goes to prison? She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. I sat down heavily in Richard's chair, trying to process this information. Both of my children were criminals. Not just selfish or greedy, actual criminals facing prison time. Melissa, how long have you known about this? 6 months. Right around the time you got your diagnosis. The timing wasn't coincidental. My fake cancer had given them hope for a financial salvation that would never come. So when I announced I was dying, it felt like a miracle. Melissa was crying now, ugly tears that ruined her perfect makeup. I know how that sounds, but Mom, we were desperate. We were about to lose everything. And you thought my death would solve your problems. We thought your inheritance would give us a chance to pay back David's clients before anyone found out. We could make it right. I stared at my daughter, this beautifully dressed woman who'd just confessed to being part of a massive fraud, and felt something die inside me. Melissa, let me make sure I understand this correctly. You and David stole money from friends and family, and you were planning to use my inheritance to cover up the theft. We were going to pay everyone back. It wasn't really stealing if we paid it back. That's exactly what stealing is, Melissa. That's literally the definition of a Ponzi scheme. You don't understand the pressure we were under. David's reputation, our lifestyle, the children's schools, everything was falling apart. So you decided to let me die believing my children loved me, while you planned to use my money to cover up your crimes. We do love you. No, Melissa. You love my money. There's a difference. I pulled out another folder from my desk, this one containing the Real will. This is my actual will. The one you'll never see probated. Melissa's eyes went wide as she scanned the document. You're leaving everything to charity? Except for small trust funds for your children. Funds they can't access until they're 30, and only if they demonstrate good character and financial responsibility. You can't do this to us. I can, and I have. Melissa, you just confessed to being part of a federal crime. Did you really think I was going to reward that with $30 million? Melissa was on her feet again, pacing frantically. Mom, you have to help us. David will go to prison. Our children will be humiliated. Their lives will be ruined. Your children's lives are already being ruined by parents who taught them that money and status matter more than honesty and integrity. That's rich, coming from someone who just spent 6 months lying to her own family. I spent 6 months learning who my family really was. And Melissa, I don't like what I discovered. So what happens now? You just abandon us? I thought about Derek in his hospital bed, broken and remorseful, accepting responsibility for his mistakes. Then I looked at Melissa, standing in my living room in her designer clothes, angry that her criminal schemes weren't going to be subsidized by her mother's death. Derek is getting a second chance because he's shown genuine remorse and a willingness to change. You're getting a choice. What choice? You and David can turn yourselves into the authorities. You can cooperate fully with the investigation, pay back whatever you can, and accept the consequences of your actions. If you do that, I'll provide legal representation and make sure your children are taken care of. And if we don't? Then you deal with this yourselves, and you never see me again. Melissa stared at me for a long moment. You're really going to abandon your own children? My children abandoned me 6 months ago when they started celebrating my death. I'm just making it official. What about family loyalty? What about unconditional love? Melissa, love isn't unconditional when it's built on lies and exploitation. And family loyalty works both ways. She gathered her purse and portfolio, her movements sharp with anger. You know what, Mom? Maybe Derek was right. Maybe you are better off alone. Because this vindictive, manipulative woman isn't the mother who raised us. You're absolutely right. The mother who raised you gave you everything and asked for nothing in return. She's the reason you became people who think you're entitled to everything without earning any of it. Melissa paused at the door. When you're really dying someday, when you're alone in some nursing home with no one who cares about you, remember this conversation. Remember that you chose pride over family. And when you're visiting David in federal prison, remember that you chose crime over character. After Melissa left, I sat in the silence of my empty house, surrounded by the possessions she'd been so eager to inherit. Through the window, I watched her BMW speed down the driveway, probably heading straight to David to plan their next move. My phone rang within minutes. It was James Goldman. Eleanor, I just got a very interesting call from someone claiming to be David Chen, Melissa's husband. He says you're trying to blackmail them and that he wants to discuss legal action. James, cancel any meetings with David Chen. And prepare yourself, things are about to get very ugly. What happened? I told him about Melissa's confession, about the Ponzi scheme and the SEC investigation and her complete lack of remorse. Eleanor, if they're really involved in federal crimes, you need to be careful. Desperate people do desperate things. I know. James, I want you to document everything we discussed today. And I want copies of all evidence sent to a safe location immediately. You think they might try to hurt you? I thought about Derek's accident, about the dangerous people he owed money to, about Melissa's fury and David's desperation. James, I think my children have become people I don't recognize. And I think the next few days are going to be very dangerous. As night fell over the Connecticut estate, I realized that my elaborate plan for revenge had become something much more serious. This wasn't about money anymore, it was about survival. The police arrived at my door at 11:17 p.m., their blue and red lights painting my driveway in alternating colors of warning. Detective Maria Santos was a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and the kind of steady voice that suggested she'd seen enough of humanity's worst impulses to no longer be surprised by them. "Mrs. Whitmore, we need to talk to you about some very serious allegations." I invited them into my living room, the same space where my children had planned my death just hours earlier. Detective Santos was accompanied by a younger officer who seemed more interested in the artwork on my walls than the conversation. "Mrs. Whitmore, your daughter Melissa Chen has filed a complaint alleging that you're suffering from dementia and that you've been making threats against her family." I almost laughed. "Detective, I can assure you that my mental faculties are completely intact. In fact, I've been documenting some very interesting criminal behavior for the past 6 months. According to Mrs. Chen, you've been claiming to have cancer when you don't, and you've been secretly recording conversations in your home. Both of those things are true. Neither is illegal." Detective Santos consulted her notepad. "She also claims you've threatened to frame her husband for financial crimes unless they sign over power of attorney to you." Now I did laugh. "Detective, I think you'll find that David Chen is already being investigated by the SEC for running a Ponzi scheme. I didn't frame him for anything, he did that himself." This got their attention. The younger officer stopped admiring my paintings and pulled out his own notepad. "Mrs. Whitmore, what do you know about Mr. Chen's financial activities?" "I know that he stole approximately $8 million from friends and family members. I know that my daughter Melissa was aware of this fraud and helped conceal it. And I know that they were counting on my death to provide them with money to cover up their crimes." I walked to my desk and retrieved the folder of evidence I'd been compiling. "Detective, I think you'll find this very interesting reading." For the next hour, I walked them through everything: the fake cancer diagnosis, the elaborate test I'd designed for my children, Derek's gambling debts and dangerous creditors, and Melissa's confession about the Ponzi scheme. I played recordings, showed photographs, and provided documentation of every conversation. Detective Santos was particularly interested in the threatening phone calls Derek had received before his accident. "Mrs. Whitmore, your son may have been the victim of attempted murder, not just a DUI accident. These loan sharks don't usually stop at intimidation." "I'm aware of that, Detective. Which is why I've arranged for Derek to enter protective custody while he recovers. He's agreed to testify against the people who threatened him in exchange for police protection." "And what about your daughter and son-in-law? What about them?" "Mrs. Whitmore, if everything you've told us is accurate, we're looking at multiple federal crimes. Wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering. We'll need to coordinate with the FBI." The younger officer looked up from his notes. "Ma'am, are you aware that making false accusations against family members is also a crime?" "Officer, every accusation I've made is supported by documented evidence. Unlike my daughter's claims about my mental health." Detective Santos closed her notepad. "Mrs. Whitmore, we're going to need you to come to the station tomorrow to make a formal statement. And I have to ask, are you concerned about your safety?" Before I could answer, my phone rang. James Goldman's name appeared on the screen. "Excuse me, this is my attorney." I answered the call on speaker. "James, what's wrong?" "Eleanor, where are you? Are you safe?" "I'm at home with the police." "Why?" "David Chen just tried to break into my office. Security caught him attempting to access your files. He's claiming that you've stolen money from him and that he needs to recover evidence of the theft." Detective Santos leaned forward. "Mr. Goldman, this is Detective Santos with Greenwich Police. We're currently investigating Mrs. Whitmore's allegations against Mr. Chen. Can you hold him until we arrive?" "He's already gone. He ran when security confronted him, but not before making some very specific threats against Eleanor's life." My blood ran cold. "What kind of threats?" "He said that if you don't transfer $10 million to an offshore account by tomorrow morning, you'll have an accident just like Derek did." Detective Santos was already on her radio, calling for backup and putting out a bolo for David Chen. The younger officer was checking the locks on my doors and windows. "Mrs. Whitmore, you can't stay here tonight. Is there somewhere safe you can go?" "Actually, Detective, I think I'm exactly where I need to be." "Ma'am, this man has already demonstrated a willingness to commit violence, and I've spent 6 months planning for this exact scenario. I walked to my wall safe, not the decoy one Derek had tried to crack, but the real one hidden behind a false panel. Inside were documents that would end this nightmare once and for all. Detective, what I'm about to show you will resolve everything. The first document was a signed confession from Derek, written from his hospital bed just hours earlier. In it, he detailed not only his own crimes but also provided evidence of David's Ponzi scheme and Melissa's involvement. The second was a cooperation agreement with the FBI, signed 3 weeks ago when I'd first contacted them about my suspicions regarding David's activities. The third was a sealed federal indictment against David Chen, issued yesterday but not yet executed. Detective Santos stared at the papers. You've been working with the FBI this whole time? Agent Patricia Newman has been posing as my hospice nurse for the past month. Everything my children said and did in this house has been documented by federal agents. So the dying mother routine was an FBI operation designed to get David and Melissa to incriminate themselves. Which they did, thoroughly. The younger officer looked confused. So you really aren't dying? Officer, I've never felt more alive in my life. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number: transfer the money or join your son in the hospital. Detective Santos read the message over my shoulder. That's a direct threat. We can arrest him for that alone. You won't need to arrest him for that, I replied, checking my watch. Agent Newman, you can come in now. The woman who'd been playing my hospice nurse for weeks entered through the back door, but now she wore an FBI windbreaker and carried a service weapon. Mrs. Whitmore, we've got David Chen surrounded at his office. He's attempting to access overseas accounts to flee the country. And Melissa? In custody. She tried to withdraw $500,000 in cash from your joint account using a forged power of attorney. Bank security detained her an hour ago. Detective Santos shook her head. This is the most elaborate sting operation I've ever seen. Agent Newman smiled. Mrs. Whitmore has been our star cooperating witness. Her children made this case for us. What happens now? I asked. Now we finish it. The arrest happened at 2:47 a.m. I watched from my living room window as David Chen was led away in handcuffs, still shouting about his innocence and demanding to speak to his lawyer. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was being arrested in the same driveway where my children had celebrated my impending death just months earlier. Melissa's arrest had been quieter but no less satisfying. According to Agent Newman, she'd maintained her innocence right up until they played recordings of her conversations in my house, at which point she'd collapsed and asked for a lawyer. Derek was the only one who wasn't in custody, but that was by choice. His cooperation agreement with the FBI, combined with his willingness to testify against the loan sharks who'd threatened him, had earned him immunity from prosecution for his gambling-related crimes. At dawn, I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee and reading the morning news on my tablet. The story had already broken. Connecticut heiress helps FBI bust family Ponzi scheme. The article was surprisingly accurate, though it missed some of the more dramatic details. My phone rang. Derek's name appeared on the screen. Mom? I just saw the news. Are you okay? I'm fine, sweetheart. How are you feeling? Physically? Better. Emotionally? I'm not sure I'll ever recover from learning what Melissa and David were really planning. Derek, you made your own mistakes, but at least you were only hurting yourself. They were stealing from innocent people. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. When did you first suspect that David was running a scam? I thought back to a dinner party 2 years ago, when David had bragged about impossibly consistent returns for his investors. Honestly? I've suspected for at least 2 years. But I could never prove anything until you and Melissa started talking so freely in this house. Jesus. So while I was drowning in gambling debt, you were watching our sister plan to steal millions from people who trusted her. Derek, the saddest part is that if either of you had just come to me honestly, if you'd said, I'm in trouble and I need help, I would have moved heaven and earth to save you. Instead, we tried to dance on your grave. Instead, you showed me exactly who you'd become. There was a long pause before Derek spoke again. Mom, I know I don't have the right to ask this, but is there any chance we can rebuild? I mean, after everything that's happened? I looked around my kitchen, thinking about the empty house that had once been filled with family dinners and birthday celebrations and Christmas mornings. Derek, rebuilding requires a foundation of trust. Do you think we can create that? I'd like to try. If you'll let me. Then let's start with this. I'm rewriting my will. Again. Mom, you don't have to, Derek, I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for your children. They deserve grandparents who love them unconditionally, and they deserve to inherit something more valuable than money. What's more valuable than money? Character. Integrity. The knowledge that they come from people who chose to do the right thing, even when it was hard. 6 months later, I stood in the visitor's room of the Federal Correctional Facility in Danbury, Connecticut, looking at my daughter through reinforced glass. Melissa had aged years in the months since her arrest. Her perfectly styled hair was now pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her designer clothes had been replaced by standard-issue prison attire. "Hello, Melissa." "Mom." Her voice was flat, emotionless. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I wasn't sure I would either." "Did you come? To gloat?" "I came to say goodbye." Melissa's composure cracked slightly. "Goodbye? Your father used to say that every ending is also a beginning. Your old life is over, Melissa. The question is what kind of life you want to build when you get out." "I'll be in here for 8 years, Mom." "What kind of life can I build from federal prison?" "The same kind Derek is building from his 1-bedroom apartment in Hartford." "Derek's not in prison." "No, but he's learning to live on minimum wage while he pays back the people he hurt. He's discovering what it means to earn respect instead of inheriting it." Melissa was quiet for a long moment. "Mom, do you think you'll ever forgive me?" "Melissa, I forgave you the moment you were arrested. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean there aren't consequences." "What about my children?" "Your children are living with David's parents and doing remarkably well. They're attending public school, learning about budgets and hard work and delayed gratification. They're becoming the kind of people you and David never taught them to be. And they know the truth? About what we did. They know that their parents made serious mistakes and are paying for them. They also know that their grandmother loves them and will make sure they have every opportunity to become better people than their parents were." Melissa started crying then, not the angry tears I'd seen in my living room months ago, but tears of genuine grief and loss. "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." "I know you are, sweetheart. And someday, when you've served your sentence and proven that you've changed, maybe we can try to rebuild something. But Melissa, it will never be what it was before." "I know." As I left the prison, I thought about the long, strange journey that had brought me to this point. The elaborate deception I'd planned as revenge had become something much more important, a reckoning that had forced my entire family to confront who they really were. Derek was slowly becoming the man I'd always hoped he could be. His job at the construction company was teaching him the value of honest work, and his weekly therapy sessions were helping him understand how his gambling addiction had nearly destroyed his life. Melissa would have years to reflect on her choices and decide who she wanted to be when she was released, and I was learning to live with the knowledge that sometimes loving your children means letting them face the consequences of their actions, even when those consequences break your heart. The Whitmore estate was quieter now, but it wasn't empty. Derek visited every Sunday with his children, and we were slowly building the kind of relationship I'd always wanted with my grandchildren. They were learning to appreciate simple pleasures, homemade cookies, walks in the garden, stories about their grandfather, instead of expecting expensive gifts and exotic trips. My real will, the one that would actually be probated someday, reflected the lessons I'd learned from this experience. The bulk of my estate would still go to charity, but significant trust funds had been established for Derek's children and Melissa's children, with one important provision: they couldn't access the money until they could demonstrate good character, financial responsibility, and a commitment to giving back to their community. Money, I'd learned, was a powerful tool. But like any tool, it could build up or tear down, depending on who wielded it and how. As I sat in Richard's chair that evening, looking out at the gardens we'd planted together, I reflected on the strange irony of it all. I'd set out to teach my children a lesson about death and inheritance. Instead, I'd learned something about life and redemption. Not everyone could be saved. But some people, given the right circumstances and sufficient motivation, could save themselves, and sometimes, that had to be enough. The end. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.